Thank you all for standing by, and welcome to the first webinar of our winter series. And can we say winter today? The series today is entitled Managing Great Lakes Forests for Managing Great Lakes Forests for Climate Change Mitigation. These webinars are an initiative of the Ohio State University Climate Change Outreach Team, a multi-departmental effort within the university led by OSU Extension, Ohio Sea Grant, and Bird Polar Research Center to help localize the climate change issue for Ohioans and Great Lake residents. I am Jill Gentis-Banicki from Ohio Sea Grant and Stone Laboratory, and joining me today is Dr. Peter Curtis, Professor and Chair of the Department of Evolution, Ecology, and Organismal Biology at The Ohio State University. Dr. Curtis is the Director of the Northern Forest Carbon Cycle Research Program at the University of Michigan's Biological Station, where for the past 20 years he's been studying the flow of carbon into and out of the Great Lakes forest, one of the only programs in the world that is doing this. His research is widely published on how these ecosystems will respond to a rising carbon dioxide levels, how climate and land use will affect carbon storage, as well as the roles biological complexity of these forests will play in the changing climate. We're really excited to have him here to discuss his research today. But before we do that, a few logistical aspects as we get started. During our presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Afterwards, around 12:30-ish, we will conduct a question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please feel free to use the chat feature located on the right-hand side of your screen. There's a drop-down list where you can choose all participants so everyone can see your questions. I'll collect and pose your questions out to Dr. Curtis at the end of the presentation. We have more than 350 people registered for this webinar, a great diverse group representing governmental agencies, academia, and nonprofit groups from around the country and the Great Lakes. So feel free to keep the questions coming throughout the presentation, and we'll have a great Q&A session. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted onto our website for later viewing. Also, we will post a webinar survey in the chat feature toward the end of the hour. Please take a few minutes after the webinar to fill out that survey. It will help us continue to bring you better webinars. So without further delay, I would like to introduce Dr. Peter Curtis from The Ohio State University, who will present Managing Great Lakes Forests for Climate Change Mitigation. Dr. Curtis, I'm going to unmute you and give you the ball.
Okay. It looks like I'm unmuted. I hope everyone can hear me fine. Thanks very much, Jill, for the introduction. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about managing Great Lakes forests for climate change mitigation. So I'm hoping everyone can see the slides. If not, someone will have to give me a signal. And hopefully as well, the technology will work at this end. So we're going to get started. I know this is a diverse audience, so we're going to cover some basics, but I hope there's enough information to keep everyone interested. And I'm going to try to keep it to a half an hour, maybe 35 minutes, so that there is time for questions. So let's jump into this. Again, I hope everyone can see now we're on the second slide. And I want to very initially throw out two definitions that I'm going to use for this webinar that will help keep it to a half an hour. And the first thing I want to do is define what I mean by forest management. And I'm going to keep this to be a fairly narrow definition, and that is if and when to harvest trees. There's much more to managing forests than just this, but that's going to be the core of the issue that I'm going to raise today, if and when to harvest trees. I'm going to touch on a few other items as well. Climate change mitigation, also a very large topic that can involve lots of different things. I'm going to talk about two of them. The first being issues relating to reducing the rate of increase of atmospheric carbon dioxide, or CO2. This is a core element of climate change, of course. CO2 is a driver of temperature changes, and reducing it is a very important component of climate change mitigation. The other that gets somewhat less press is relating to reducing the rate of species loss as climate change proceeds. And so these are going to be the two elements of climate change mitigation that I will direct, or I'll be referencing. Okay, next I'd like to give a little bit of a roadmap of where we're going in this webinar. The first thing I'd like to do is to give a very brief overview of the Great Lakes Forest. I know many of you in the audience are from this region, some are not though, and I want to give a little overview of what I'm talking about, and particularly some issues of the history of land use in this area. I'd like to then move on to establish the connection between forest and climate change with respect particularly to the carbon cycle, get everybody on the same page there. Then we're going to go to a central question for managing carbon storage in forests having to do with whether or not to harvest the forest. We'll discuss the theory and some issues relating to that in this section. I'd like to move from there on to talking about biodiversity, species diversity, and ecosystem resiliency, and whether these are important for climate change mitigation. And finally, wrap things up with, I hope, some conclusions, and then with some time for questions. So that's where we're going. Okay, well, the Great Lakes Forest. This is a map that I've borrowed from the Northern Research Station of the Forest Service, the U.S. Forest Service, that portrays the Great Lakes Forest as they existed in pre-settlement times. And this is a heavily forested area. It is and was. And it is an area that encompasses the states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and of course the province of Ontario as well. Not so much Ohio, although some of our northern forests certainly qualify as well. It's an ideal environment for growing trees. It has a quite benign climate, although some of you in the UP might dispute that, but it's a good area, ample rainfall, the absence of frequent large disturbances, and it lies at the interface between two floristic zones, the boreal zone of the north and the mesic hardwood forest of the south. So it gives us a very diverse species mix as well. An ideal environment, and very large. This was a forested area. We're looking at something like 140,000 square miles of forest pre-settlement. That lays the framework. This very important element of the landscape of North America. These forests, the Great Lakes. These forests were an extremely important and attractive resource for Europeans as they moved across, European immigrants as they moved across North America. I think beyond or following our exploitation of whales in the ocean, this was really the first large-scale natural resource extraction from this continent on this scale. So these forests were exploited and essentially completely cut over in about 60 years, really less than that if you consider the period of maximum activity. So beginning on the order of 1860, loggers and forestry people who had learned their skill in the forests of Maine and New York and Pennsylvania came to Michigan, Wisconsin, later Minnesota, and were able to clear these forests of their timber. And following this clearing, these forests experienced very large and catastrophic burns, which arguably did more to affect the landscape than the clearing of the forests themselves. And this clearing was, as I say, the harvesting was virtually complete. There are trivial, or, well, I shouldn't say that, very small amounts of original forest left. These are important for study and to visit, but they're very, very small elements of the landscape. Minnesota having the most at perhaps 2.5% of the original forest, Wisconsin, Michigan less than 1%, and these are clustered in small areas in the northern part of that landscape. So very little in the way of the primary forest remaining, and this gives us a picture of the extent of the clearing. It's very different from the land use, for example, further west, where much more of the original forest cover remains. However, Well, then let's take a look at the current status of the forest. So following this period of clearing and then regrowth of the forest. And this is very important in a theme I'll return to. So again, a map of the modern forests of the Great Lakes states from the Forest Service, and illustrating a number of important points. About half the original area it remains. So that the southern portion of the states in particular have been largely converted to other uses. And although if you were to go to these areas, they are certainly impressive forests, they bear a closer examination, and particularly an examination relative to the original records of the forest. The current forests bear very little structural or compositional resemblance to the original forest. So different structure and different mix of species for the most part. And what that means, or one of the consequences of that, is that they're quite young, by definition no older than when they were cut. So most of these less than 100 years old, and much more homogeneous in their species mix than the original forest. For the most part, you can see in the orange color here on the map that many of them are dominated by the early successional species, aspen and birch. So while there is still a impressive forest cover, very different from the original forests that were there. However, and this is quite important, these forests are not static, and this is a theme I'm going to be returning to, but that natural processes are changing these forests, and this is what we refer to as ecological succession. And so this is a cartoon illustrating the change in species and to some extent structure as forests move from the clear-cut burned over area, this would be at year 0 if you look down at the bottom, to where the yellow or the red star is, where we are now after about 90 or 100 years. And we are at an interesting time for many parts of the Great Lakes forest as in an ecological transition between the communities, mostly even-aged, aspen-dominated forests that characterize this period following the widespread clear-cut, transitioning into a very different forest made up of other species, uneven-aged, more diverse species of maple and oak and pine, among others. And this is occasioned by the mortality of the aspen and birch that can be due to a number of things, among them natural senescence. This is about as long as these species are expected to live. So we stand at this ecological transition between the aging young forest, if you will, and then forests, which I refer to as potentially old, which bear more resemblance to the communities that came before. So not static at all, and a very interesting time for us, particularly as we think about climate change. So these potentially old timberlands, quite extensive in area, much more than at the primary forest, the remaining primary forest. And I have some numbers down in the lower left-hand corner of this slide, but some distribution areas, just where these are distributed. But you can see perhaps 2.5 to 3 million hectares of a potentially old forest out of a total current area of about 20 million hectares. So perhaps 15% of this extensive timberland area, forested area, is in this age class in transition, or potentially in transition from the early successional to later successional species. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of an overview of the Great Lakes forest, what the landscape is that we're talking about. I'd like to move on to this connection between forest and climate change. And now these are related in a number of ways. I'm going to focus on the carbon cycle, but clearly they're connected politically. I've just taken a few examples of that here from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. A highlighted text reads that forest-related mitigation activities can reduce emissions from sources and increase CO2 removal by sinks. So identifying forest here as important in this aspect of mitigation. And then part of a web page from the organization carbonfund.org, circled at the bottom, that reforestation is a very important element of their strategy for reducing CO2 emissions or mitigating CO2 emissions. And there are others as well. The Chicago Climate Exchange, for example, recognizes carbon storage in forests. So there's a political connection to climate and forest and climate. But this is driven by forests and ecosystems' role in the carbon cycle. And I'm just going to get everybody on the same page about what I say, what you need to know about the forest carbon cycle. This is an image I borrowed from a children's science page from England, and I like this. This is sort of a watership down kind of a sensibility to it, either a very small tree or a very large rabbit in this illustration. But the salient issues of the forest carbon cycle is that carbon in the form of CO2 is acquired through photosynthesis and stored in various places and is transformed, but it's lost through the process of respiration. So we have an inflow of carbon through photosynthesis and a loss through respiration. Now we have a large respiration arrow coming from the rabbit. In point of fact, most of the respiratory carbon loss from a forest comes from the soil, from the bacteria and fungi and other microorganisms in the soil that decompose organic matter. Now, the important point here is that this is a net, the storage of carbon is a net between these two processes, and that's illustrated in the box at the lower left. That is to say, carbon storage occurs when the input of carbon through photosynthesis exceeds that loss from respiration. Now, if the reverse is true, the ecosystem is losing carbon. So then that happens at various times of the year and in some cases on a continuing basis. So carbon cycles, carbon in and carbon out, photosynthesis, respiration, and storage is the difference between those two. A small term, I'll show you some numbers that will illustrate this. And this is precisely what we study, my group at the UMBS, the University of Michigan Biological Station Forest Carbon Cycle Research Program. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to our group. There's a list of some of the principal investigators and our institutions. It's a multi-institutional, multidisciplinary activity, a map showing you where the biological station sits. It's in what we call the tip of the mitt, the northern lower peninsula of Michigan, very solidly within characteristic forests of the northern Great Lakes. I also want to mention that the research I'll be describing was supported by the U.S. Department of Energy, and we're very grateful to them for that, their support. Picture is of last year of our research group, students, faculty, and so forth. What we do is, I think it's mentioned in my bio that we're carbon accountants. So we spend a lot of our time trying to figure out where the carbon is and how it got there. And so this is just some illustrations of what we call our ecological or biometric studies of forest carbon storage. We get up in the canopy and measure photosynthesis. We're down in the understory measuring what's going on with the understory plants. A lot of the carbon is in the soil, so we spend a lot of time figuring out how much is there and how fast it's leaving. This is a very heavily instrumented forest site, one of the most intensively studied forests in North America. The map shows some of our permanent plots. I'll describe the tower, the flux tower, in a second. The little black dots are 10th hectare permanent study plots. We have close to 100 of these now across the landscape in several of these towers. So a lot of time and energy spent running around, sort of like finding the missing penny, to find out where all that carbon is in the forest and how we think it got there. And then importantly, sort of the high-profile instrumentation is housed on these meteorological towers. They're actually just sort of same as cell phone towers. This one is 150 feet, and it allows us to very rapidly monitor the exchange of carbon between the atmosphere and the canopy. And so we can measure very precisely and very rapidly the net downflow of carbon, so it's carbon coming in and CO2 in the atmosphere, and the the exiting of carbon. We do this 10 times a second, and we aggregate the data, and so we can tell on an hourly and daily and seasonal basis what the net exchange of carbon was from the atmosphere to the trees, to the forest canopy, to those leaves. So two different approaches, ecological and meteorological, to studying the carbon cycle. And we've been doing this for over a decade now, and following on work of ours studying elevated CO2 effects, which I won't be getting into today. So all this work gives us a very accurate picture for this particular forest, which I say is quite representative of the amount of carbon and where it's distributed. And I have to thank Jill and her colleagues for producing this graphic here of carbon storage in a Great Lakes forest, showing you both the total amount of carbon stored, and that's down there, the 80 tons per acre. And I hope my conversion was correct from metric. We always use metric units, but this is English units, short tons and acres. And so about 80 tons, and you can see where, and that's how much is just sitting there in the forest and where it's distributed, a little bit more below ground than above. So over 50% of that is in roots or in soil organic matter, with the remainder being in trunks and branches, and then a bit in leaves, and then in woody debris. And then we study as well how much is going in and out on an annual basis. So that's the arrows. So the net photosynthesis, about 2.9 tons on average for a given year. Some are higher, some are lower per acre. But of that 2.9 going in, about 2.2 leaves, and so we're left with a balance of 0.7, a profit, if you will, of new carbon added to this system per acre per year. Most of that being, or the vast majority of that being in wood, in above and below ground wood. Soil carbon accrues very, very slowly, even though most of the carbon is below ground. It's added in forests like this very, very slowly. Most of that annual carbon gain is in the wood. Okay, so let's get to the question of management. Managing for carbon storage. We got a lot of carbon there. Can we increase it? What might we do to see this increase? And so I'm going to approach that by laying out what the conventional theory is about forests, and particularly how they store forests as they age. I'm going to throw out some problems with conventional theory, and then I'm going to pose a counter theory that, in fact, the conventional theory stating that young forests sequester more carbon than older forests, and my counter theory will be that carbon storage, in fact, increases following the ecological transition that I just described in our Great Lakes forests. It doesn't necessarily extend to all forests in the planet. So the conventional theory of carbon storage is forest age. This is a well-regarded theory that was first proposed by Gene Odom in 1969. The reference is at the bottom of the slide. I just want to point out a couple of key elements of this, and that is illustrated in the top panel. Is labeled forest succession with years along the x-axis. And what this theory suggests, and I'll see if I can get my pointer, here we go, is that wood production, which is the slope of this line B here, and carbon storage, which is the shaded area here labeled P sub n, these are maximized in young forests, so 30 or 40 years old. So the slope of that line and the amount of carbon in there is maximized at this point, which would argue for maintaining forest in this age class to maximize these processes. So if you have a forest that's out here and you cut it, it will be growing back into this zone. So maximizing wood production. This is certainly a typical strategy for maximizing wood, but we can analogize this to carbon, or extend that analysis to carbon. And importantly, as forests age, so approaching in this case 100 years or so, the slope of the line B and the amount of that shaded area both go to zero. So conventional theory is then that carbon storage in old forests is near zero. The photosynthesis is balanced by respiration. That's the conventional theory, and well regarded. And I want to point out that our data from our site actually provides support for this theory. And I'm just showing you some of those data from a recent publication. Get my pointer back here. Let's see. Here we go. And what we've been doing is studying annual carbon storage here on the y-axis across time, and we've used what we call chronosequences, stands of different ages, to reconstruct the past carbon storage at this site as a function of several things. Climate, and these are data from the tower. It's variable, and some years are lousy years for carbon storage, and others are good years. And then there's a effect of disturbance on how much carbon is stored. But we see this decline, a rise and then a slow decline in carbon storage, with the result that annual carbon storage now in 2011 is lower than it was, say, in 1960 or perhaps 1970, 30 or 40 years ago. So we see this process happening. So what's wrong with it? Well, when we look more broadly, and when we look at particulate meteorological data from towers around the world, the picture is emerging, and we've done this in several groups. This is a recent publication from Europe, and then one of ours, looking at across many different sites. And this NEP is the same thing as carbon storage. It stands for net ecosystem production. But we see that there's evidence for substantial carbon storage, carbon sequestration in forests that are much older than 100 years, so out to 200, perhaps 300 years old. And only as forests get to extreme ages, perhaps 400 years, 5, 6, perhaps 800 years in some European forests, do we see this predicted decline. So the evidence is that even in these older forests, certainly 100 years out to 200 or 300 years, that substantial carbon sequestration can go on. And this came as a considerable surprise, but the evidence is now quite convincing. And we're looking, and one of the things that we're doing is looking into why that is. And I'm going to go into some of those data briefly. But another important element in thinking about management has to do with the losses. So we see that older forests can maintain uptake, but we also know much more about what happens to soil carbon following harvest. And these data are from a recent publication from a student of mine and myself and some folks from the Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service, about a large-scale analysis of data on harvest effects on soil carbon. And in the left-hand panel, this is the effects on the forest floor, and that's this area of organic matter right at the surface, just a top few inches of the forest floor. About a third to a half of the carbon is stored up here. What happens, and we see substantial losses, 40%. On average, about 30% depends on what's being harvested. Substantial losses in forest floor carbon. When we look further down in the mineral soil, and there's about twice as much carbon stored here as in the forest floor, we also see, depending on the type of soil, potential for substantial losses. Not always. It's better buffered from harvest, but potential for substantial losses. And I may have time to get into this in the questions. But we know much more about the potential losses of this substantial soil carbon pool. So we're throwing out then a counter theory that carbon storage actually may increase because of structural and biotic complexity as forests age. And this illustration is from our site, and I'm going to step us through this very quickly. Here we are actually in 2011. We've undertaken an experiment to test this hypothesis. Here are the carbon storage data from the tower. There's been a disturbance which is accelerating that natural process of a succession. There'll be a recovery to a more diverse system, and we're postulating this will recover at a higher rate of carbon storage than it was before. And this is being tested in an experiment that we refer to as the Forest Accelerated Succession Experiment, or FACET. And we've accelerated succession by stem girdling all the aspen and birch over about 100 acres of forest. I want to point out that a key variable for how this response will be, where the recovery will be, has to do with where nitrogen ends up in the system. So if the ecosystem maintains its nitrogen capital, we expect to see this increase in carbon storage. If it's lost for any reason, this will inevitably result in at least a temporary decline in carbon storage. So this is our alternative hypothesis. And what I'd like to do for the remainder is just to show you some data in support, or some of our early data that we believe supports this contention. And along the way, actually, I wanted to briefly mention this issue of biodiversity and ecosystem resilience. In fact, they're all, related. Are these important for climate change mitigation? And the key issue here, and this is illustrated just in a conceptual way in this left-hand panel, where ecosystem process in the y-axis is plotted as a function of the species richness, the number of species in an ecosystem. And theory predicts that as that number of species increases, that ecosystem processes such as carbon storage will also increase. But more important for this conversation is what happens as species numbers change, as we expect will happen in climate change. And what we see is that if you have ecologically similar or compensating species, as are illustrated in these the top and the bottom panel, as we see a shift in species numbers, there's very little effect on ecosystem process. In other words, these ecosystems would be more resilient to the effects of species numbers change, which we expect to happen with climate change. And another way of expressing that is with the concept of resilience, ecological resilience, which is illustrated here and well illustrated in this bottom panel, where a system with low resilience will be unlikely to return to the original state than one that has high resilience. So, and from theory, we would predict that higher biodiversity from over here equates to or translates to higher ecological resilience. And we would suggest that this is a very important characteristic of forests as we're confronting climate change. So what are some evidence, some of our data that might provide evidence for this? Well, we have found over a decade or more of study at the biological station that more diverse plots, more diverse forest plots are indeed more resilient to carbon storage changes. And so the cartoon here illustrates my point, supported by these data, but let's just walk through this very carefully. What we found was that in forested plots which are solely dominated by these early successional species, aspen and birch, but have few later successional species, they're very susceptible to this decline, the theoretical decline as succession proceeds, as these forests age. They're very susceptible to these changes, these declines in production. However, more diverse forests, which include middle successional species, illustrated here by this white pine, are much more resilient and, in fact, in many cases are increasing wood production, net primary production, NPP, through successional time as they age. So a high resiliency versus a low resiliency system tied to their diversity. And the data over here, which I don't have time to get into, illustrate this, a positive relationship between the amount of leaf area in later successional species and their response to and increasing diversity and increasing wood NPP. And these are data taken over, very detailed data taken over a decade at UMBS in these forest plots. So clearly a relationship between diversity, species diversity, and resiliency with respect to carbon storage. And that a new area that we're very excited in has to do with the structural complexity of these forests. And by that we mean the presence of gaps where leaves are in the understory versus the overstory. Aspen-dominated forests typically have their leaves clustered at the very top of the canopy, whereas older forests have a much more even distribution of leaf area as you move from the top to the bottom. Of course, more structural complexity means more habitats. And again, this could be very important as other organisms, animals, and in particular mobile organisms, are being moved around with climate change. Finding appropriate habitats is going to be much more likely in structurally and biotically complex systems than it will be in structurally and biotically poor or homogeneous systems. And we're measuring structural complexity in our forests using technology known as LIDAR, which is a laser based around laser rangefinders. And this is my student Brady Hardiman walking through the forest with our portable LIDAR, the rangefinder. And using this technology, we can very precisely map the density of leaves and branches vertically in the forest, and that's what's illustrated in this green figure here. This is a 30 by 30 meter plot, and the degree of folding and the number of gaps is expressed in a statistic which is called rugosity, and we have some data that's in review illustrating this. And what we found is that, and again illustrated in these data here, that as plots age, and this is about 25 plots, I believe, they tend to become more rugose. And those that have a higher rugosity, have greater structural complexity, also are more productive. So we're seeing, again, a relationship between the characteristics of an older forest and the maintenance of this unusual or surprising, from the standpoint of conventional theory, maintenance of carbon storage. So we're getting close to the time here. I want to have time for some questions. So I'm going to wrap up the data part. Just some thoughts as we move forward, at least in successional time. I want to suggest that as Great Lakes forests age, they very often become more structurally and biotically complex. This is certainly something that we're seeing with careful monitoring. This increasing complexity facilitates sustained carbon storage. It helps account for these unusual data from the meteorological facilities. They help facilitate greater ecological resilience, which is going to be important in climate change, and enhance species conservation as a function of both of those. I do want to point out that forest management that mimics these natural ecological succession is highly possible. There's some excellent demonstrations of this. I want to particularly acknowledge the work of the Forest Service at the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. Very important in establishing some methods that we might do this, albeit, I would argue, also at relatively small scales. Again, can be locally important, but in terms of climate change impacts, 7 million acres of potentially old forest ought to be allowed to naturally transition to these more complex states for maximum climate change mitigation impact. And lastly, just a few conclusions. Sum it up. I hope I've convinced you that many of our Great Lakes forests will experience an important ecological transition over the next 25 to 50 years. And this transition has very important implications for carbon cycle dynamics and the resilience of these forests to climate change. Our forests have historically been and will no doubt continue to be very important sources of wood products, and very definitely many sands can and should be sustainably managed to meet our wood products needs. However, managing for climate change mitigation argues for allowing natural ecological succession to proceed within many of our Great Lakes forests. And with that, I will be happy to respond to questions. So I'm going to guess I'm going to get some input from Jill, or I think she's acquiring them, or should I just, you're going to have to give me some direction, Jill, at this juncture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Curtis. We've gotten quite a few great questions during the presentation. So let me just get started and ask questions to you, and we'll try to get as many as we can covered. And what Dr. Curtis can't answer, we'll have provided on the website later. He'll answer those later. All right. So let me and there's a couple of them that reference slides. So it may be easy. I'm going to just let you, Dr. Curtis, keep the ball, and that way you can, if you need to reference a slide, you can still do that.
Very good. Can you hear me? I guess, are we talking simultaneously?
Yeah, we should be fine. Okay, one question that, and I want to say it was in referencing slide 22. It was dealing with how does the tower measure carbon flux to and from the canopy?
Okay, no, I'm happy to explain that, and it wasn't slide 22, so we'll just go back here. Let's see. At least according to I'll see if I can find the slide without going, let's see. One more. Here we go. Carbon is moved into and out of forest from the air, so from the overlying atmosphere, and this is done through atmospheric turbulence. And so the technology that we use is often referred to as eddy flux. So these turbulent eddies, just like an eddy in water, deliver carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and mix it down into the forest. So what we're doing is measuring the concentration of CO2 as it wafts down into the forest. So that would be the downward spin of that eddy. So you can imagine, I'll get my little dot here, air moves across the landscape in turbulent eddies, sort of like this. So it just rolls across the landscape like water washing up on a beach. And so we're able to measure the CO2 concentration on the downswing of that turbulent eddy, and then we measure it on the upswing, as well. And so in a very simple term, if the CO2 concentration is higher, let's say it's 381 parts per million when it was going down, and 380 parts per million of CO2 as it was going up, 1 part per million stayed down here someplace. So if on average the CO2 concentration is higher going down than coming up, the system is taking up CO2 or anything else that you're measuring at that rate. Conversely, if the CO2 concentration is higher going up than it is when it's coming down, the system is giving off CO2, and of course that happens every night. So this switches night to day. So when the sun comes out, lights go on, photosynthesis starts, CO2 is higher on the downswing than the upswing, lights go off, photosynthesis stops, respiration, of course, continues. CO2 is higher because it's being released by all this stuff down here, mostly plants and microbes, back into the atmosphere. So that's how we measure it, essentially right at the surface. And it works remarkably well. We can get a very accurate picture, although it's a black box. We don't know where it's going. So the previous slide, 13, is when we open up the black box. So here's all where all that carbon is going, and plus it gives us a constraint on our numbers from above canopy. Hope that answers the question.
Oh, thank you. Another question that we had was, in your opinion, is structural or species diversity more important for carbon uptake, storage, and or resiliency?
That's a very good question. I'm gonna get that in a couple of. I bring up another slide, but I don't have it right on me. Well, no, it's a very good question. Right now, as we're going forward, structural complexity, I feel, is going to be a very important driver, and there's a couple of reasons for that. But one very important one is how the forest process light energy coming into the system, and the species diversity is important over successional time, certainly, but many of these species are complementary to each other, at least, although we're looking into that. But the structural element we think is key because of deeper canopies and more complex canopies. Two reasons, really. They absorb and utilize incoming light more efficiently, and this is really a very new area, but that we make use of the towers with, is that they're more efficiently connected to the atmosphere. They get that penetration by turbulent mixing is more efficient in more complex canopies with gaps and so forth. So actually they take up CO2, especially down lower, more efficiently. So if I had to put a slight advantage on one or the other, I'd put it on structure. And I would add, actually, that structure is extremely important for animal habitat utilization, as is the biotics. But structural complexity is really, really important.
Okay, thank you. We have several questions dealing specifically with forests, but I want to first ask a question about the biofuel mandates. There is much discussion about the demand for wood increasing biofuel mandates through renewable fuel standards. Will this have a positive or negative impact on forest ecosystems, and in particular carbon in those ecosystems?
That's a really good question. And to the degree to which, so we're now talking about managing forests for biofuel production. And so we've made the decision at that point that these are going to be very intensively managed forests, and the mitigation is not so much in the storage of carbon at those sites, but in offsetting fossil fuel use, for example. So using this renewable energy source for offsetting fossil fuels. So my argument, my contention would be that we have areas which are very well suited for intensive forestry. I think in many cases these are not necessarily in the Great Lakes area, which in further south, for example, with longer growing seasons and more fertile soils. But certainly in some areas of the Great Lakes, those conditions are met as well. The issue there then becomes, how do you minimize carbon losses from those systems on those forests, which will be intensively managed? I think that this is something that the Forest Service is very heavily engaged in. Some of our results will speak to that. So, for example, how you manage residue following a harvest, very important for affecting how much carbon is lost from the soil. So if you have complete residue retention, this tends to eliminate, if I can find my slide, let's see, just to get to the point about soil carbon. Here, for example, let's see, I think, these ultisols here, tillage, for example, in some cases, prior to replanting, sites are tilled as part of the site prep. This tends to release more carbon. That might, in some of this carbon loss relates to tillage practices, and if that's not done, you may avoid those sort of carbon losses. So appropriate management, particularly of soils, to minimize carbon loss is extremely important in these intensively managed sites. There are a number of other issues with biofuel. Focusing on biofuel productions, I think, is very important. A complete carbon or greenhouse gas accounting is necessary. So if fertilizers are used, this is another. These can release nitrous oxides, for example, that are active greenhouse gases. So before we jump into this, particularly at a large scale, these are really important issues that need to be addressed. I would argue that in many cases, turning these northern forest lands on infertile soils over to forest product biofuel productions would be a bad idea from an accounting standpoint.
Okay, thank you. A few questions we have specifically dealing with forests, and we can switch back over to managing a little bit later. One question, and I'll just kind of do this in a sequence. Are older or younger forests more susceptible to forest fires or other disturbances like ice storms? And another question dealing specifically with the forests, are we seeing a similar response in tropical forests? Do you know?
Okay, yeah, both good questions. The likelihood that a fire or an ice storm might happen is largely independent of age. There's some qualifiers to that. So a forest, the probability of the likelihood that it will burn badly is a function of, among other things, fuel loading, and that in an older forest, of course, you have a greater likelihood, greater opportunity for fuel loading than in the younger forest, so that might result in a worse fire. Most of the Great Lakes, large fires are not a big issue, and part of that is simply because of the mesic climate. Following the clear cutting, fires were a huge problem, but fire frequency in terms of very large landscape events, quite rare now. On the other hand, ice throws, wind throws, ice damage is an issue. That's historically and certainly currently one of the major large-scale disturbances that the forests experience, and that is much more independent of age, I would think, than would be than forest fires. So that sort of gets to that question. Mostly age independent, but we do have to consider things like fuel loading. Some species are more susceptible to wind throw than others, for example, as well. It's much more patchy, though, and older forests experience these patch dynamics. That's just part of the landscape, if you will. Tropical forests, very interesting question, much more complicated. The relationship between age and carbon storage, though, is thought to be basically the same for tropical forests. I mean, the conventional theory is not, even though it was developed, Odum developed this with the northeastern forest in mind, in fact, the underlying theory should apply equally to tropical forests as temperate ones. The data, particularly meteorological data from tropical forests, is much, much smaller. It's extremely difficult to get those good data of that kind in mature tropical forests. So we just don't have a good handle on whether mature tropical forests are continuing to store carbon. Say a tropical forest that was 300 years old or 400 years old would continue to store carbon at the rate of one in a comparable forest in the temperate zone. We just don't have those data.
Okay, thank you. I did want to ask one question that from an 8th grade class, just because I wanted to entertain an 8th grade class question. They were wondering what kind of trees are in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. What is the dominant tree species in Upper Peninsula of Michigan?
Well, let's go back to the UP. A great place. If you're from the UP, you should feel lucky. One of my favorite places. That was the pre-settlement forest. The Upper Peninsula has got a wonderful assemblage of species, a combination of the great conifer stands, so in which white pine, of course, was the historic king of the woods, and still enjoys quite an abundance of quite a large representation, but other pines as well. Red pine, northern hemlock as well are very important conifer species. Then we have the mix of what we call northern hardwoods, and that would be sugar maple, of course. If you've been up there in the fall, you'll see them. Basswood, of course, and aspen and birch, very important elements and beautiful ones of that northern of the UP forest. So basswood, birch, maples, and then of course the white pine, red pine, hemlock, the conifer assemblages. I'd say if you have an opportunity to go to the western UP and visit some of the remaining stands there in the porcupine, or further south in the Sylvania tract, very much worth your while to visit those. That give you a very good impression of what the pre-settlement forests were like.
Okay, thank you. I want to do one last question, and this is a managerial question. We have several other questions that, again, if you don't mind answering afterwards, we'll have posted on the site with the archived webinar so everyone can see those answers. The last question I have is, it seems that the benefits of not harvesting in this specific case is because the forest that you're discussing is in early successional or transitioning to a later stage. But many forests in the Great Lakes are already dominated by northern hardwoods. What do you recommend in terms of management for climate change mitigation in those such forests?
Yeah, so this is certainly, it's a very good point. I mean, so we have many areas where perhaps a later successional sear is represented. I think the structural and continued emphasis on structural and biotic complexity is the key here. And this can be, I find it's hard to imagine active management of those elements over broad landscapes. However, creating efforts such as are being proposed for ecological management to the extent that one can create gaps, for example, in the forest canopy, regionally looking at different elements. I mean, if you're looking at a multiplicity of species to increase ecosystem resilience. So this, I think, falls under the category of ecological management. And those two elements, structural and biotic complexity, that then should propagate to resilience and continued carbon storage. So part of the message is that you're not going to lose, that evidence and mechanism suggests that carbon storage is not going to decline substantially as these forests age. So in a sense, we can take that off the table as being a major element of concern. So with that off the table, we can think about ways that you can manage the forest for species conservation, and that's all about complexity, and to make sure that the mechanisms that are causing this, the maintenance of carbon storage through age are present off the landscape, which may or may not be the case. And our evidence would suggest that structural complexity is a very important element of that.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Curtis. I wanted to thank, again, Dr. Curtis for his willingness to talk with us today about the Great Lakes forests and their possible impacts with a changing climate. We'll have the rest of the questions answered on the website. And this was a really interesting discussion. I did want to remind you that our survey URL is on the webinar, or for this webinar is in the chat feature, so please take a few minutes to fill that out. I also wanted to mention that resources from Dr. Curtis's research, as well as many others from the subjects that we've addressed on climate change, are located on the changingclimate.osu.edu website, including an archive of these webinar presentations. This webinar series will continue next month with a presentation by University of Wisconsin's David Leibel on February 15th about climate change and stormwater management in the Great Lakes, with the series continuing monthly through June. I wanted to thank Dr. Curtis again and all the participants on this webinar. We hope this was beneficial and hope you'll join us again in an upcoming webinar. Thank you, and have safe travels with this crazy weather we're having. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. Thanks, everybody, for attending.